In the corner of the room, a human head lay on a rough-hewn table. It wasn't entirely visible at first, but as the man moved closer, it became unmistakably clear. An unmistakable horror. Lena was born in 1913 in a small village in Ukraine, nestled at the foot of a distant mountain range where winter seemed to last forever. Her family lived on the outskirts, and like most of the rural villages in the region, their lives were a delicate balance between survival and scarcity. By the time Lena turned 19 in 1932, the Soviet government's hunger-driven policies had begun to affect her village, and the nightmare of the Holodomor began to unfold. The famine, which became a historical tragedy and was later recognized as genocide against the Ukrainian people, took hold of everything and everyone in its path. The famine was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The land that once fed the village turned dry and barren, as if even the earth was grieving the loss of life. Crops withered, livestock died, and death itself seemed to linger in the air, thick and suffocating. Millions perished in what would become one of the darkest periods of human history. The Soviet regime's cruel policies allowed no mercy for the people they had already oppressed, and as desperation set in, a sinister shift took place. Desperation bred cruelty, and cruelty gave rise to cannibalism. It became common knowledge that in the darkest corners of the village, and in many others like it, people began resorting to the unimaginable to stay alive. Some families, unable to stave off hunger any longer, made the horrible decision to kill and eat the youngest members of their families, deeming them expendable. It was a grotesque echo of the suffering they had already endured. Lena's world was no longer the peaceful place it once was. Her family fought to survive with whatever they could scrape together, and Lena could never forget the silent faces that passed by, gaunt and hollow-eyed, as if the very soul had been sucked out of them. Yet there were moments, brief and fleeting, where things seemed almost normal. But these moments didn't last long, and even the smallest crumbs of food were impossible to come by. Then, in 1936, Lena discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been a joy, but in a time of such darkness, it felt more like an ominous sign. She wanted vegetables, fresh, raw, and nourishing. It wasn't a craving exactly, it was a desperate yearning, one that seemed to pulsate in her belly, demanding to be satisfied. Her search began that morning, her belly round and heavy as she wandered the streets of the village. The sky was overcast, and there was an unnatural stillness to the air. The streets were empty, almost as if the village itself held its breath, waiting for some calamity to strike. She passed house after house, but no one had vegetables. It seemed like she was wasting her time, but then, as if on cue, a small voice cut through the silence. "Need something, lady?" A boy no older than 8 stood by the side of the road. His cheeks were unusually full, a stark contrast to the sunken faces of everyone else in the village. She studied him for a moment. His round face and chubby cheeks, which seemed too full for someone in such dire circumstances. "Yes," Lena said, with a forced smile. "I'm looking for vegetables. Do you know where I can find some?" The boy's face split into a wide grin, revealing a mouthful of crooked teeth. "I know just the place," he said with an odd intensity in his eyes. "Follow me, lady. I'll show you." Despite herself, Lena felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the boy's demeanor unsettled her, but desperation outweighed her caution, and so she followed him down narrow, twisting streets until they arrived at a dilapidated house, barely standing against the elements. The hovel reeked of something, metallic. Blood, perhaps. But no, it was a smell she couldn't quite place. The door was nothing more than a tattered curtain, and as the boy pushed it aside, she felt a sudden unease wash over her. The air inside the hovel was thick, suffocating with an ancient, dreadful odor. The dim light made everything appear shadowed and murky, and as Lena stepped over the threshold, she saw a figure moving toward her. a man, holding a heavy plank of wood raised above his head, as if ready to strike. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs frozen in place. In the corner of the room, a human head lay on a rough-hewn table. It wasn't entirely visible at first, but as the man moved closer, it became unmistakably clear. An unmistakable horror. The head, with its wide, unblinking eyes, seemed to gaze directly at her. Lena's mouth went dry, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stop!" a voice from the far corner of the room rang out. The man lowered the plank and Lena stumbled backward, her hand clutching her stomach in instinctive protection. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing. The woman who was spoken now stood in the shadows, her face gaunt and hollow, eyes dark like empty wells. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something else. Something cold and calculating in her gaze. "You should leave," she said in a low voice. "You're not one of us." Lena stood motionless, barely able to comprehend the horror unfolding in front of her. The woman stepped forward, her gaze flicking over Lena's swollen belly. "The boy knows we have standards," she continued, her voice like the rasp of dry leaves. "We don't kill pregnant women. Go. Leave now. Do not tell anyone what you have seen. You may go, but we can change our minds." Lena didn't need to be told twice. She turned on her heel, her legs unsteady beneath her, her mind reeling from the grotesque scene she had just witnessed. The boy's grin flashed in her mind, a memory she would never shake. She left the hovel in a daze, her heart pounding in her chest. The world outside seemed too quiet, too empty. The woman's words echoed in her mind as she walked home. Lena couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if they hadn't noticed her pregnancy. Would they have killed her? Would they have turned her into another piece of meat for their macabre table? As Lena settled into her bed later that night, her stomach still churning with the horrors she had seen, she wondered if the hunger for human flesh would ever go away. She wondered if the people she'd encountered that day were just an aberration, or if somehow it had become an unspoken rule among the villagers, a perverse survival mechanism that no one dared to confront. But as the years passed, the memories of that day didn't fade. When the famine finally ended and things began to return to a fragile semblance of normalcy, food was still scarce. People were still hungry, and food was still a luxury only the rich could afford. The world had changed, but something deep inside of Lena had shifted as well. She had learned what true hunger could do to a person, and she knew that there were far worse things than starvation. Eventually, she left Ukraine. She escaped the ruins of the Holodomor and made her way to America, hoping for a better life. But even in the safety of the new world, she could never forget the look in the eyes of the woman in that shadowed hovel, the chilling thought of what might have happened if she had been just another victim. Lena had lived through the darkest days of hunger and desperation, and though she had left the land of her birth behind, the hunger never truly left her. It lingered, like a specter in the back of her mind, whispering in the silence of the night. Sometimes she would wake in the dark hours, heart pounding, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't been pregnant that day. She had escaped the horror of the famine, but could she ever escape the darkness that had taken root in her soul? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. If you know of any other eerie stories you'd like to expose, please comment below.